Good evening and welcome to Face to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh Eliathambi. A few days ago, a group of eminent economists from around the world made a dramatic call for the immediate suspension of Sri Lanka's external sovereign debt repayments and a new restructuring of these debts following the devastation caused to the country and its infrastructure by Cyclone Ditwah, which we are by now all familiar with. This declaration was coordinated by Professor Charith Ghosh of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, by Debt Justice of the United Kingdom, and by the Institute of Political Economy Sri Lanka. And this very dramatic and far-reaching document is today the subject of much discussion because it has brought up some very crucial points which need to be considered. I am pleased to welcome to the show today Charith Gunawardena, who is the co-founder of the Institute of Political Economy Sri Lanka, which is one of the organizations which put together this appeal, this declaration with regard to Sri Lanka's debt. Good evening and welcome, Charith. Nice to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much, Niresh, for inviting me again in this very important opportunity, and pleased to be able to talk about this statement which was done a couple of days ago. Yeah.
Right. So, Charith, let's talk about first and foremost the 121 eminent people who signed this. I think there are people from dozens of countries here, and these are heavyweight names. They include, for example, Professor Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University, who is, of course, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, a very well-known figure, and all these 121 signatories are experts in this field. So the world needs to listen to what they are saying, and I'm quite gratified that 5 of these 121 have actually been on this show face to face, apart from yourself, of course. They include Professor Charith Ghosh, whom I mentioned earlier, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, who is also of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura of the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, Dr. Howard Nicholas of the International School of Business in Vietnam, and Dr. Ndongo Sambasila of the International Development Economics Associates in Senegal. So quite pleased that all these ladies and gentlemen have appeared on this program before. Now, Charith, to put all this in perspective, let's talk about the mess, the financial mess that Sri Lanka got into, and this boiled over in 2022, and then of course we had this entire restructuring process, and the repayments were scheduled and so on. And there has been a lot of debate over whether we got the best deal or not. And now, can we actually continue with this, given what has happened with Cyclone Ditwah? So let's put the whole thing in context.
Thank you, Niresh. I think it's a good way of getting going by just looking at how we got to this situation, and also some of the background of the current agreement which we have. So if you recall, when the just before the presidential elections, there was a IMF restructuring program which was agreed to. The framework was agreed to,
This is September of 2024.
So it was rushed just before the election. And following that, the new government actually, for pragmatic reasons, and I also think because of IMF intransigence, they decided to go ahead. I think the main purpose was to try and ensure economic and political stability in that initial period. And they continued with that program. And I think right up to now, that objective was basically fulfilled.
The targets were generally
fulfilled, but one of the things I think they didn't want to happen was people's well-being to be worse than it was. There was not a lot. There were some programs that were done to improve them, but not adequate to make a real change yet.
Right.
So I think they just played
social safety net.
Yeah. So they just did what they played with the tools that they had, and they came to this situation. But one of the main issues was actually the shortcomings of the IMF debt sustainability analysis, which was the foundation for all the negotiations with the creditors. And that particular one had a lot of big shortcomings. For example, it was very creditor biased. So the well-being of people and the local environment didn't take a prominent place in that particular DSA analysis. All the numbers were more to ensure that Sri Lanka was going to fulfill its external debt obligations, not a lot about people's well-being and long-term development. So if you look at something like when it was published, IMF also said that it's not really a full long-term sustainable solution, and they themselves said that there was a 50% chance, a likelihood of us defaulting again. So that there was a big problem with that. Now, some of the big issues which we faced was also the international sovereign bonds, which were issued by us, and a lot of the private creditors were holding a lot of these bonds. And some of these bonds, you could argue, could be spoken about even as odious debts, because Sri Lanka had a regime which was fairly well known to be had governance issues and problems. And normally when you lend money to if you're an individual or a business, if a lender lends money to you and they don't do their right due diligence and the company fails or go bankrupt, you lose your money. In this international field of sovereign debt, the lenders there's no sovereign bankruptcy mechanism for a country. So therefore, if you go bankrupt or get into trouble as Sri Lanka was, the creditors still have to get paid. So there's a lot of time where you have this idea of a predatory lending, because they don't face any risks. All the debts are governed either by the law of the New York laws or London laws. And generally they sort of support the creditors more than the developing countries. So those things are really a bit of an issue. And then there were also some other real fundamental problems with that. The debt servicing targets given to Sri Lanka in the DSA was based on a percentage of the GDP. Now our GDP is basically a rupee-based economy, but our targets were saying it has to be a percentage of GDP measured in dollars. So the exchange rate risk, again, we were carrying. And what should have been happening is our debt servicing target should have been a percentage of foreign exchange earning, not GDP, because our rupee economy doesn't help us pay back dollar debts.
Right.
So one of the fundamental issues was they didn't tie those things. They also then gave a target of nearly 25% of the government revenue had to be allocated towards foreign debt servicing. That's a huge issue. And when you have that type of number, what's going to happen is you have little domestic funding to invest in people's well-being and also development programs.
Right, because we already have, apart from that 25% in debt servicing, we have this bloated public sector with over 1.6 million state workers. So paying their salaries and just servicing this public sector is also taking an enormous chunk out of the government revenue. So there's very little left to help with the social safety nets.
And also the other issue was there was also a target called the primary surplus, which we had to spend less than our earnings, and we had to have a primary surplus of 2.3%, which is also really one of the highest around the world for countries of our size, and that is the fundamental one for driving austerity programs, right? So you start with an agreement which was really a problem to begin with, but at that time a lot of the analysts and people like Jayati and all these economists, they also mentioned this earlier, that the agreement was just hoping for the best and not doing any planning for the worst. And there was no capacity in that agreement for Sri Lanka to absorb a external shock.
Right.
And there are lots of external shocks which were there. For example, the oil price over the last year has been quite good. And previously it has been twice the cost of it, what it is now. So there's always a danger of oil prices going up. And if that sort of thing happens, we'll struggle to absorb that sort of shock. Then you have things like the Trump tariffs. Arbitrarily, a tariff comes into play. And again, Sri Lanka has no control over that, very little control. It's done for other reasons, and those things can impact us. Then there's also things like, I think last year there was a travel warning given by the USA around November time. Germany followed up on that, and suddenly the tourism was impacted. Now that's only a travel warning, but if for some reason, if there's a travel ban or something, very easily our economy can get destabilized even further. And so there were supply chain issues which can disrupt our economy, and also anything to do with our remittances. If there are some problems in the Middle East and impacts our remittances,
right?
All these are external shocks which are completely uncontrollable by us.
Yes.
But one of the biggest ones was also any climate emergency.
Yes.
And we had no capacity in the whole agreement, though people knew about that, IMF knew about that, but they just put really tough conditions on the government and the country. And we just had to play with that game because there was easily no way of fighting that back. And sure enough, the crisis did happen. The external shock did happen, causing with the Cyclone Ditwah, which has caused enormous issues right now. And I think the World Bank Group has just issued a statement saying that the estimated damage, physical losses, is about 4 billion. And that doesn't take into account rebuilding costs, loss of incomes and livelihoods, and cost of rebuilding. And so there could be, it could go up to between $6 to $7 billion. That's an enormous amount for a country like Sri Lanka to absorb. The IMF themselves have made an assessment of maybe it will impact, Cyclone Ditwah might impact our economy by 2.5% to 5% of GDP. It could be as high as that. There'll be a widening of the balance of payments up to even $700 million a year. The inflation target of SL, the Sri Lankan Central Bank, also they are saying it might go up about 5%. We'll have potentially higher import costs because some of the hydropower is impacted, and we might have to also import more oil to generate the energy requirements we need. We might there is a worry about the external reserves. We have about 6 billion at the moment without usable reserves, because some of that is also to do with the Chinese swaps as well. So our net reserves is about 2.2 billion. So there's not a lot in the bag either. And like you were saying earlier, many of the people, nearly 2 million people have been impacted, and across all the 25 districts. So the situation we are facing right now is there's a huge human cost in terms of lost lives, missing people, and also livelihoods. So that's really where it comes up to. And then government now has to try and really balance this, and you really need support from the external organizations, because we are facing a huge external debt crisis. We had that all the time, and now the challenges are enormous.
Right. Now, Charith, you mentioned the external shocks, and there are so many which you spoke of, and there are even more. We had COVID, there's international terrorism. I mean, something could happen anywhere in the world which could impact travel. We saw that with 9/11, where all of a sudden people didn't want to travel, and it impacted to global tourism and so on. So these are all beyond our control here in Sri Lanka, and you might even argue it's beyond anyone's control. But why is it that these things are not included in these agreements? Because they are very real. You can't even think that, okay, for the next 5 years there won't be a pandemic, there won't be global terrorism, there won't be issues with oil prices. You can't even begin to think that way. We know these things happen. We are hoping they won't all happen, but we know that to be realistic, at least 1 or 2 or 3 of these factors will come in. So why is it that when you get these this enormous restructuring process, these agreements, why aren't these factored in?
I mean, it's a lot to do with the whole global economic order, which is basically unjust. From the time of the Bretton Woods Agreement after the World War, you had the US dollar, which was selected as the reserve currency, and it's only the America who can issue currency. So they have enormous amount of power over that, over the dollar. And if you try to weaponize that, then a lot of people across the world, if that's the reserve currency, gets impacted. So, for example, USA has their total debts are at $37 trillion, which is almost $100,000 per person. And in contrast, Sri Lanka has $3,500 per person. And they say we have the debt crisis, right? Now, so when they print those levels of money, or when they create that sort of funding, usually you're expecting the reserve currency to fund the global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, ADB and stuff like that. It has to be funded. But they are not getting those right resources they need to sort of ensure global financial stability and also poverty alleviation. So what's happening is that these countries who hold the reserve currencies, they are issuing the currency. It's not going into the global institutions, and generally it's ending up with hedge funds, private equity, high net worth individuals, and those people want to now profit from their investments. So they hold all this money, and they are the ones who are buying debts across sovereign debts from issued by other countries. And what IMF are doing is they are not giving any concessionary loans to countries like Sri Lanka and asking us to go to the commercial money markets to borrow. And those interests are so enormously high, and they really tie countries like us in deep debt. And it's not only Sri Lanka. Across the world, there are about 50 countries who are suffering from deep debt distress. Many of the African countries, and if you look at Bangladesh, Pakistan, a lot in Southeast Asian countries, and that's purely because of a broken global economic order. And unlike during colonial times when you had foreign troops sitting in your countries, now you have financial colonialism. Basically, you still get completely controlled. And what's missing is that the system also discourages countries like Sri Lanka to be really manufacture high-end goods. They discourage us. So they want to use our resources and cheap labor, but add value overseas. So we are really struggling all the time to get out of this cycle. So if you export goods like just garments and tea, it's very difficult when the buyers will suddenly say, oh, if you charge a little bit more, we are going to move the production to Bangladesh or Kenya or something, right? So all those industries, commodity industries, we struggle to make the right amount of foreign exchange to deal with essential imports. So basically, a country like Sri Lanka needs a certain amount of foreign exchange for its imports like oil, medicines, high technology, fertilizers. We need a foreign exchange. But if your tools to earn that can easily be impacted by external shocks, the country is always at a risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's why there needs to be a real rethink about these issues. And some of these economists who have signed this statement, they all do lots of research work in these areas.
Right.
And they are really willing to help countries of the global south. That's why it was easy to pull some of these big names like Thomas Piketty, Stiglitz. There are other really eminent ones like Jason Hickel, Stephanie Kelton, Kate Roberts. She does some really good work. So there are many very good economists out there who are willing to help countries of the global south if they pull and ask for the support they need. Just to give an alternative to this IMF mantra, because if you just go down that same road, there is very little evidence to say that countries of the global south can come out of get a sustainable solution to its debt crisis.
Right. So it's a matter of who's on our team, isn't it? And this is something that, from 2022 onwards, we at Newsfirst, we queried this, especially during the Ranil Wickremesinghe regime. Who were our experts? Was it simply the central bank, which got us into this mess in the first place? Or then there were a couple of consultancy firms internationally who were hired by the government. But it was too clouded. This entire process was too clouded, and at the same time there were many foreign experts who, as you said, had worked on this kind of problem in other countries such as Ecuador and Argentina and West Africa as well, and they knew a lot more about this than our local experts here in Sri Lanka. But we didn't seem to gather a very strong team, and this is why the question will always remain: did we get a raw deal? And at this point, not many people are convinced that we got the best deal in the restructuring process. So even at now, of course, this government, when it came into office, as you said, for the sake of continuity, did go ahead and sign. But now with Cyclone Ditwah, we have reached another very dramatic point, haven't we, where we now have to look at, can we continue with this?
So I think that's why it's really important now to take a fresh look at that. So if you use the same groups of people to advise in this particular instance, I think we might end up getting similar answers. I mean, and it's a lot to do with the ideology as well. So if you take the IMF type thing, they are fully for private solutions going across some of these issues. Now, for a country like that, if you tie in profit to do a lot of this work, you can't do it to really solve people's well-being issues and environmental issues. So you need a mechanism to also look at financing in other ways. Now, what people don't have a ready-made answer to give right now, but what's not happening is there's not even a space for the debate. So you need to, I mean, the recommendation for government should just continue what they're doing, but also really look at the other ideas that are out there. And that's not happening right now. Groups like Lazard and Clifford Chance, who are part of that team previously, in other countries, they're also advising the creditors. So in some instances, they advise the borrowers and sometimes the creditors, right?
So
they're all in.
Saying there's a bit of a conflict.
They might have, I don't know, they might have firewalls between the stuff. But the fact is that you want someone who's absolutely passionate about the people and environment,
right?
And call out the gaps of the global financial order. Not that you can change it, but really highlight that. And you have to be able to sit in front of your lenders and have your numbers and your case. So when Sri Lanka went for the negotiations, they used the IMF debt sustainability analysis. They used Lazard and Clifford Chance. And internally, locally, there was no one really fighting for our numbers. But for that, you need to do a lot of work. You almost need a independent DSA. Not that IMF or the creditors will accept that. But at least you know your numbers really well. And you have to say, we have a mandate to fulfill these obligations, right? And these numbers will help us deliver that. We need your help to achieve that, because that's, if you're respecting democracy, right? We need the international financial institutions to really support those issues. And here are the numbers. Here's the logic behind it.
Absolutely.
So, and there are these experts, like we're saying, including Nobel Prize winners and stuff, who can do the work. They won't do it without government sanctions, because they don't want to interfere with at that level. But if people want the assistance, and they also offer other countries. And I know the Argentinian ex-foreign minister, Martin Guzman, they also have done work on debt sustainability analysis. There are people in the African countries who have done the work. Now, whether they fully succeed or not just depends on the IMF. But at least you have your numbers. You know you're doing everything within your power, having your argument to give the best deal for the people and the local environment. So I think one of the outcomes from this should be, you have to absolutely talk to IMF and stuff, because we are in that agreement. But you also have to look at other things in parallel. And one good highlight was, I mean, if you looked at the rapid financing instrument which IMF offered last week, they are giving us a loan of $200 million. It's after 3.5, it's deferred for 3.5 years, and then it's at 3% interest rates or something, which is quite fairly low, but it's still more debt. We are already in a debt crisis, right? IMF is adding more debt to our issues, right? So what they are not offering is, despite this huge issue we have, they are not making any statements about actually having debt cancellation, large haircuts to the principal, because we can play around with borrowing, right? We are borrowing now to pay debts. And what Sri Lanka really needs is a seriously sustainable solution to its debt crisis, external debt crisis. Right. And just going around this circle, it's not going to give us any real chance. We will just fight our way through the process. but Sri Lanka will continue to struggle, not Sri Lanka, but lots of the poorest people will continue to struggle without really having that conversation and argument and not accepting that. I mean, we can't obviously overcome that and fight them to force them to make the changes, but you really need to have a serious conversation with your numbers.
Absolutely.
And I think at the moment that's missing. And so that's why I think it's a useful time to really also look at other people, look at the other ones, there are loads of organizations out there trying to help nations, because even if you're in Europe or Africa, they know the systems are not fair. So there are groups called Debt Justice UK, a European Debt and Development, Eurodad. There are Jubilee USA, Jubilee Germany. With all these experts, they know their governments and their systems are really exploiting the people of the global south, and they are willing to sort of put their efforts and help. If there are gaps and information that's needed, they will certainly try and assist countries, and they do. They help African countries, South American countries, right? But only if they want to listen.
Right.
Only if they want to listen.
So we need to ask first.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a need, then... so I think our type of organization is just networking with these people. So you know that they have lots of skills and areas. And if there is a need, people can actually pull them in to assist.
Absolutely. Right. Lots of other questions that I have for you, but first we'll take a short commercial break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Valuable FD, the symbol of stability.
When you listen to the numbers, it's huge, which is why we also identify this as one of the largest catastrophes, disasters that has ever fallen on Sri Lanka. As you said, 1/5 of the country is actually affected in terms of landmass, and 2.3 million is a huge number in terms of our population as well.
And that really would take anywhere from 3 to 6 months just to make sure that people's immediate food security needs have been taken care of. What we also always try to do in these situations is, even as we're planning our emergency response, that we already start thinking and building into it ways to support people's early recovery.
There is a disconnect between, the people's ability, understanding the people's ability to, respond to these disasters, and also, people's ability to also, express how they can respond to them as well.
Valuable FD, the symbol of stability.
Fear, love, pain, joy collide on one stage. Emotions evolve into extraordinary talent, creating a journey. Unfolding Sri Lankan greatness to the world. Here begins a new chapter.
Sri Lanka's Got Talent Season 3!
December 27th onwards, every weekend at 8:30 p.m. on Sirasa TV.
Valuable FD, the symbol of stability.
ඒකෙන් දන්නේ උඹ තමයි සිස්. වාවමව.
කොල්ලා මොන වැරද්දක් කරාටද මේ තරම් දුක් විඳින්නේ. ඌට නම් ගොඩේමක් නැහැ මේ කපේට.
එහෙම දෙයක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ බේමියා. කවදාවත් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මෙහෙන් ගියාම වෙදගෙදර අමතක වෙන්නේ නේද?
කවදා හරි අනිවාර්යෙන් ඇත්ත එළියට එනවා.
මේක කොකා ගැස්සුවොත් මොකද වෙන්නේ කියලා උඹ දන්නවනේ කියන්න ඕනේ නැහැ නේ.
සදේව් ඉන්නවා වාසුලා.
මේව තමයි මැඩම් ගේම්.
දැන් ඔයාලා ඌව හම්බුණාද?
හම්බ වෙලා කතා කරන්න ගොඩාක් දේවල් තව තියෙනවා.
අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Charith Gunawardena, co-founder of the Institute of Political Economy, Sri Lanka. Now, Charith, one of the things which we see all over the world is when a country gets into debt issues, then there is a lot of political uncertainty. Governments are weakened because on the one hand they have fiscal issues, on the other hand they become unpopular with the public, with the voters, as they try to make repayments and bring in austerity measures and so on. So it is a very tenuous situation as far as democracy goes, and we've seen this in countries from Argentina to wherever. We've seen this happen, and we saw it happen with the last two governments in Sri Lanka. It was the fiscal situation which ultimately led to the bankruptcy of the government, basically, and we couldn't pay for fuel, we couldn't pay for medicines, we couldn't, imports just stopped, and that led to a peaceful revolution, yes, but the fall of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government, and then the succeeding government of Ranil Wickremesinghe, after 2 years, well, we saw what happened at the polls. It was voted out of power. So this is what happens. So my question here is, isn't there a fine line here which one can tread, where you ensure first and foremost that your people are taken care of, and not first and foremost the creditors? Shouldn't that be the absolute focus? Take care of the people, because we saw during those two regimes in Sri Lanka the poverty rate just skyrocketed. I mean, we had a huge segment of the population living below the poverty line, and you can't have that. And there's no point saying, oh, we're making the repayments when you've got people falling below the poverty line. So how do you get all these creditors, IMF, everybody to focus on the population, number one?
I mean, the problem you mentioned, it's not just in Sri Lanka. This is what you're seeing globally. So if you take somewhere like the USA, even when people who are struggling vote for what they think is a more center-left party like the Democrats, and they don't solve the social issues, all you're doing is opening the door for really far-right people to come in. If you look at somewhere like the UK now, they had 14 years of conservative rule, and they voted for a Labour Party, and they are still not delivering the social programs people expect. And now you have quite a far-right party called Reform, who's leading the polls quite a way. And you can see that all over Europe as well. The problem, therefore, is the political parties, if you do not solve the problem, particularly the center-left party, the left parties, people have nowhere to go. And it really opens the door for extremists to make sort of divide and rule, and just cause, because then you have no one to go, no one to support and vote for. So I think it's very critical in Sri Lanka, when you have a progressive party, they shouldn't fall into the trap of following, think that the markets and that system will solve it on its own, right? The state has to play a serious role to solving some of the people's problems. I mean, a good example I can give is, if you have any private company and you look at the low-paid workers of the private company, can those workers afford a house in the city, say for example, right? So you're employed in a company, they are paying your salary. Can your fellow private sector constructing firms and home builders build a house for your workers? And if they can't do that, whose job is it to solve those issues? It's a state, right? So you have to be able to take on those challenges and say, if you do not solve real issues of people, the governments are going to be in trouble. And one of the issues which continually comes up, even in the UK, is no one really is interested in the sort of the bottom 20% problems. Because one fault in the democracy is if you satisfy 80% and they don't really care about the 20%, right? Those people are always in poverty, right? So you need a state which actually also really solves real issues. Otherwise, you have a system where you can have a thriving business based on exploitation, but it's not really a sustainable solution for countries. So if you're really keen to come out of this, the balance between the state and the private sector has to be resolved. I fully agree with you. The state, if you have those numbers of people, they have to do that job. You have to serve the public. If you're in the public sector, you have to really serve the public. But having big public sector organizations is not a problem on its own. There are a lot of social issues and stuff, right, which are not really meant for profit making. If it's care type work, health work, environmental work. So if you want to pick plastics out of a beach or riverbed or something, right, there's no profit to be had there. Someone has to do that, right? So I think it's a time, if you want to really solve those issues, you have to take a re-look at it now. And Sri Lanka right now is going to be in they have opportunity to look at these things very seriously. Because if we just try the same things as we did before, it's not going to help Sri Lanka at all.
Right. To give our viewers a little bit of background on my guest tonight, Charith Gunawardena has had a distinguished career in the private sector in the United Kingdom. He was formerly a local councillor for Enfield Council in the UK and has run for Parliament as a candidate of the Green Party for the constituency of Southgate and Wood Green. He holds an MBA from the University of Westminster, an MPhil in Electronic Engineering from the University of Essex, from which he also obtained a BSc in Electronic Engineering. Charith, now you have had a background in the sciences, and scientists around the world have proven that climate change is real, the earth is warming, and there are enough and more models which now predict what this will mean, from health crises caused by the global warming to weather-driven disasters. We see the increases in temperature, in the wild swings of heat and cold, and indeed in hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, all of those around the world. You can call it a hurricane in some parts and a cyclone over here, but it's essentially the same thing. But you see this happening more and more. So shouldn't weather be inbuilt into contracts of this sort, into these agreements? Because it's not a one-off event. We can't even begin to think that, we won't have another Ditwah for another 20 years. We can't even begin to think that. It might happen next year. Hopefully not, but it might. So shouldn't more emphasis be placed on this?
I mean, definitely that's very critical, particularly if you talk about the climate-related issues. You can see these extreme weather events happening across the world. If you look at the Caribbean, it gets hit multiple times.
I mean, Jamaica got
just recently
hit very
Philippines gets impacted very much so, and they also say now the Indian Ocean is warming a few degrees higher, and if there are cyclones, the strength of those will be very powerful right now. Just this year, like you were mentioning, there were 3 cyclones simultaneously across in South Asia. So there is a definite impact on that. But the main point, though, is also that countries like Sri Lanka haven't contributed to this climate crisis. I mean, we emit about 0.08% of carbon emissions is our contribution to the carbon footprint, right? So we didn't really cause a lot of these issues. And the big consuming powers who has actually done a lot of these things, particularly in the industrialized countries like in the US and Europe, they really bear a big responsibility in terms of solving these issues. So when you have consumption levels which are through the roof in those areas, they can't really ask countries like Sri Lanka and the people who are at $3-4 a day of income to bear the brunt of that transition. So there has been lots of attempts by the global South countries to get climate reparations, get funding to get to help with the transition, but the big countries have been resisting it. So if you look at COP30, which just happened, USA didn't even participate in that. And a lot of the monies they keep on pledging each time on these conferences, they never actually emerge. Now, so because of that, it's even more important that when you sign these agreements, you protect yourselves from all these external shocks. It's not just climate. So you really have to get those into those agreements. And if you are sitting looking to Lazard and Clifford Chance to do the recommendations for you, they won't include that. So someone locally have to be really passionate about your own interests and fight for those type of changes. So now I know that IMF have postponed their 5th review. It was supposed to happen on the 15th of December. They've they deferred it to early 2026 because they realized that the baseline has changed enormously in Sri Lanka. Now, for those negotiations, right, Sri Lanka has to really put some thought into it and look for outside help, because if you sit and ask the same people, they won't even have, they will just protect the status quo. They will keep the system as is, and they won't seek really radical alternatives to try and help Sri Lanka's position. So I think even in those new performance reviews and negotiations, somehow Sri Lanka needs to find a way to widen its knowledge base. How do you negotiate with these people, right? Because there were some other really dangerous things that were included in those debt restructuring deals. Private creditors, I think there was a agreement where we cannot, they are protected from debt cancellation in the future. So even if there are predatory lending practices or something, a lot of those deals which were signed were still favoring the private creditors. So I think you're quite right in raising that issue. You have to be really careful about the deals you're signing, and you need teams of people who are really passionate of looking after the well-being of the people over the creditors. And it really has to be that. You have to really take on that battle and fight for the country's interests very specifically.
Right. Now, the eminent group of persons has called for the suspension of debt repayments for the time being. And one reason they have given is that and I'm reading from the document here. Current onerous debt servicing undermines efforts to rebuild lives, restore agriculture, infrastructure, and provide social protection. Now, this is very true, isn't it? Because we basically need a lot of money to get back on our feet. And of course, we are getting help. India has offered, the United States, and a lot of organizations and countries are offering some help, but it's never enough, is it? We need to marshal our own resources, and it would help if we didn't have to spend so much on interest payments and so on. So that's what the group is calling for, isn't it?
Absolutely. So right now there's been quite a few people who are trying to help us. So like we said, the IMF is giving this rapid financing instrument to $200 million. India has been very good. They gave a grant of 100 million, and they've also given a 350 million loan on concessionary terms, which is quite useful. And then, but across the country, across the world, there haven't been huge amounts. There have been bilateral support. US has given $2 million, UK about 1 million, so smaller numbers. But the scale of our issue is so huge. It's in the billions, and we need to be able to really reduce our external debt payments, the interest. So that's the core issue. So, and unfortunately, the likes of the financial industry are now again trying to commodify nature. So they are trying to come up with debt to nature swaps, green and blue bonds, right? Again, trying to make money out of misery, right? Because what Sri Lanka needs is a definite cancellation of certain debts, or at least a huge haircut on those. Now, people are still trying to financialize these tools. So, debt for nature swaps. I know the government has not signed. They are thinking of issuing a what was that? They had a strategy, climate strategy document that has been developed and released, and we are thinking of having $11 billion of climate funding. Now those are again loans, right? And what we still need to fight much harder is on the cancellation side. All these ones they are in control, and some of these debt for nature swaps and green bonds and stuff, other countries have used them, and there are many critics. There are lots of academic papers which are showing where they are failing. So some of those are very difficult to measure. Loads of communities get displaced to implement some of those programs, and all of that is because in those countries where they are giving the funds from, they don't want to cut their consumption, right? So all their forests are down and their consumptions are high, driving big cars, fast fashion, single-use plastics, and they do all those type of things. And the poorer countries have to now try and build the mangroves and plant forests and stuff like that, right? Sri Lanka does have to protect its own biodiversity. We have to look after our land, our soils, our oceans, and air quality, but not as a part of the program to solve the global climate issues. There are people who are dropping and manufacturing bombs in huge volumes, right? So all the little saving you're doing is negligible compared to some of the environmental damage caused by these high-tech weapons and stuff. So I think we have to look after our own environment. That's a very critical thing. But be careful with all these financialized tools when they have this climatized the instruments, right? Debt for nature swaps and green blue bonds particularly. do not always give the countries the best benefit, because some of these green bonds, there's slightly marginal concession you get from some sort of restructuring, but nothing like a traditional restructure. I think some of those averaged around 3% of benefit to the country. If you go through a proper traditional restructure, you are really aiming at over 20%. So you don't want these sort of financialized tools, more financial tools, right, to solve these issues. We want less of those.
Absolutely. And I am very much afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Charith Gunawardena, who is a co-founder of the Institute of Political Economy in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. And from all of us at Newsfirst, we wish you a blessed Christmas, and we'll see you again on face-to-face next Monday as usual. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.